Since the program was first made public on December the 5th, the research team at TESA has been studying it, and then it was later on amended on the 24th of December. We've also been studying the amendment, and we have done a few analysis, and my job this morning is just to share some of the results of our studies. It is no lie that Ghana is on the brink of economic crisis. There is very high inflation rate at the moment. The cedi has significantly lost its value. GDP growth is slowing. There is high unemployment rate in the country. But underlying all this macroeconomic instability is the fact that public debt in the country has been deemed unsustainable. As we heard the Minister of Finance himself in the previous video admit, the government is not in a position to pay interest on the debts they owe, or even part of the principal of the debts they owe. In this graph, I am showing data from the Ministry of Finance's own debt sustainability analysis. According to the Finance Ministry, the current public and publicly guaranteed debt to GDP ratio is more than 100%. Their goal is to bring this debt to GDP ratio to 55% by 2028. In their assessment, if they can put the economy on a path that shows that the present value of public and publicly guaranteed debt to GDP ratio is 55% by 2028, then they feel they have a chance of restoring macroeconomic stability in the country. So that is the major problem facing the economy at the moment. We have a debt issue. We have a big public debt crisis in the country. So what is the solution? As advertised and as also shared by the Ministry of Finance, this is the approach to restore debt sustainability and macroeconomic stability in the country. The first thing is to adjust, to make fiscal adjustment. By fiscal adjustment, they are reducing expenditure from the budget and also trying to increase revenue from the budget, not only in the 2023 budget, but also in subsequent budgets. The Minister of Finance has made it clear that that effort in the 2023 budget was shown when they reduced the expenditure to GDP ratio by about 3 percentage points in the 2023 budget. So that is one way they are trying to restore this macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability in the country. The second major way is through structural reforms. Many of us may have heard of the government preach about digitalization in the country, using technology in all forms of means to boost revenue, to increase productivity, and then to also increase GDP growth. Well, if this works, this is also a way we can grow our economy and then reduce our debt to GDP ratio. And then there's a third major way, which is debt restructuring. Restructuring is just a fancy way of saying reducing our debt, literally reducing how much we owe other people. Now, the government has two main types of debt: what it owes foreigners and what it owes domestic residents or Ghanaians. They are yet to announce the full details of the external debt restructuring, but what we know so far about the external debt restructuring is there is a hold on interest payment on external debt. What they have instead done is to announce a full detail on the domestic side of the restructuring. And this is what they are calling the domestic debt exchange program. The domestic debt exchange program is an attempt by the government to restructure domestic debts by inviting domestic lenders to swap their existing debt for new debt. The characteristics of this new debt that the government is offering is that it has lower interest rates and it has longer maturity. So you have a particular debt you hold, and then the government is literally telling you, since our economy is not on the right path, bring how much we owe you. Let's give you a new certificate. And that new certificate will show that we owe you a lower amount, basically. All right. Now, who are the people in the economy that the government owes? This data is from the Ministry of Finance as at 2021. A large chunk of public debt in Ghana is owned or is held by the banking sector. By the banking sector, I mean depository institutions and then the central bank. As at 2021, the banking sector held about 51% of all public debt. There are also insurance companies who owns part of the debt. Foreigners also hold part of the debt, and then SNCC also hold part of the debt. But a significant portion of the debt is held by what the Ministry of Finance categorizes as other holders. Now, who are the other holders? Part of the other holders are individual bondholders. I presume the man we just heard on the clip is an individual bondholder. So he would fall in that subsection. Among the people in that same subsection are non-banking financial institutions, and then collective investment schemes, such as mutual funds or such as clients of TESA. You are also part of people who hold government debt. In the announcement that the government made on 24th December, they listed a number of instruments which they are offering a new instrument for. In total, they had 67 number of instruments, of which 58 of those instruments were cedi-denominated bonds issued by the central government of Ghana. That number of instruments had an outstanding principal payment of about 121.39 billion Ghana cedi. And then there were 6 Ghana cedi-denominated bonds issued by ESLA PLC and 3 Ghana cedi-denominated bonds issued by Dachi PLC. In total, the outstanding principal of the debt the government is seeking to restructure domestically is valued at 132.38 billion Ghana cedi. This is just the principal of the amount. Now, I want to go into the financial terms of the new bonds being offered by the government. The government is categorizing the old bonds into 2, and then they are proposing new bonds to replace these 2 classifications of old bonds. The first classifications are bonds that were supposed to mature in 2023. So if you held any of these 67 bonds and then they were due to mature in 2023, you'll be in the first category, the upper category here. The second classification of bonds are bonds that were due to mature after 2023, that is from 2024 and beyond. If you held any of these 67 bonds and they were due to mature from 2024 and beyond, the government categorized you into the second class, that is bonds that mature after 2023. Let's first review the financial terms of the bonds that were due to mature in 2023. According to the government, they were going to issue 7 new papers to replace all bonds that matured in 2023. Now, these new bonds will first mature in 2027, and it is not the entire amount of bonds that will be redeemed or that would mature, but just 15%. of the new bonds will mature in 2027. And then they will let another 15% of the total mature in 2028, 14, 2029, 14, 2030, 14, 2031, another 14, 2032, and finally, another 14 in 2033. So meaning that if you held a bond that was due to mature in 2023, the government is going to extend the maturity by roughly about 10 years. Okay, so the bond would have matured this year. They have extended it by 9 more years to 10 years. The government also intends to pay coupons on the new bonds, just that the coupons they will be paying would not be exactly the same amount of coupons that you expected on those bonds. From our research, we noticed that the average coupon on those 67 bonds were about 20%. But this time, the government would not pay any coupon in 2023. They will pay 5% in 2024, and then 9% in 2027. And then from 2027, they will be increasing the coupons by 0.15%, meaning that in 2028, they would increase the coupon by 9.15%, 2029, 9.3%, until finally, when the bond is maturing in 2033, they will pay 9.9%. The rationale behind this adjustment is to cater for the yield curve, according to the government. Unfortunately, for those who are also, I think fortunately is not the right word, we are in unfortunate times, but on top of the coupon payments made by the government for the bonds that will mature in 2023, the government is also throwing in what they call a cash tender fee. So literally, they'll pay 2% of the outstanding principal to bondholders who had bonds that were due to mature in 2023. These were the financial terms of the bonds that were supposed to mature in 2023. Not all bonds were supposed to mature in 2023. A large fraction of the bonds were supposed to mature after 2023. Those bonds had different sets of financial terms. Whereas the bonds that would have matured in 2023 were spread into 7, the bonds that mature after 2023, forgive me, were spread into 12 new bonds. The earliest of those new bonds would mature in 2027, and then the latest would be 2038. And then it also has some consideration ratio, and the government pays interest or coupon in a similar fashion as they would for the 2023 bonds. Okay. In our research, we realized that the average maturity for the bonds that mature after 2023 was probably around 5 years. But in this new bond offer, the maturity is about 15 years. Okay. So the government is not only reducing the interest payment or the coupon payment, but they're also increasing the maturity of the bonds that we held. Now, let me share some of the results of our analysis with you. In our first study of the domestic debt exchange program, what we did was we took an investor who held a fraction of the bonds. So the particular bond certificate we analyzed had a principal or face value of 1 million Ghana cedi. It had its own terms. I think it was due to mature in 2027. So we spent some time analyzing the haircuts or the losses that this particular investor would incur should he go ahead with the domestic debt exchange program. In our analysis, we realized that this particular investor would be losing about 66% of the present value of his bonds should he exchange the bond for the new bonds being offered for the government. Okay. Literally, this investor who held our indicative bond would have lost 66% of the wealth or the value of his bonds. We also tried to investigate the perception that there was no haircut on the bonds that the government was offering. If you may have followed the government's communication, you would have realized that the domestic debt exchange program has been marketed as one that embeds no principal, no haircuts on principal. Okay. In as much as that is true, the government is actually not literally reducing your principal, but because they are reducing coupon payments and elongating the maturity, in essence, they are incurring a haircut on the value of your bond. So we did an experiment and then we figured out that, well, if the government had kept your previous terms of the bond and then decided not to pay your principal at maturity, you would have been better off than exchanging your bonds for the current domestic debt exchange program being offered. So we realized 100% haircut on principal would have led to just about 21% losses for the particular bond we studied, the indicative bond. Whereas maintaining the domestic debt exchange program and accepting the new offer would have incurred about 66.6% haircut. Okay, so you are actually better off receiving your coupons until maturity and telling the government, okay, you can keep my principal. Yeah, as crazy as it sounds, yeah, that is what we realized. Now, one criticism that we had about this particular study was this may not be a reflection of every investor's situation. Remember, I told you we studied just one indicative bond held by an investor. The face value of the bond was $1 million Ghana cedi. I have just shown you that the total outstanding principal supposed to be exchanged for the new bonds is about 132 billion Ghana cedis. So we only investigated about 1 out of 132,000 of the bonds. So this may not be a true reflection of every investor's case. And that was a genuine criticism. So we took our analysis a step further. This time, we took all the 67 bonds that were eligible for the domestic debt exchange, including the 58 government of Ghana issued Ghana cedi bonds, the 6 EXLA bonds, and then the 3 Dache bonds. All the 67 bonds, and then we analyzed each bond one at a time, and then aggregated our solution, aggregated our results. Now, this graph summarizes our findings from studying all the bonds. Our results show that on the settlement day, that is the day the government is going to partake, or the government would do the exchange, they were offering a settlement value. Now, this settlement value can be thought of as the price of the old bonds, because the government is setting a price for the old bonds that they are buying back and then exchanging it for new bonds. Okay. The settlement value included the outstanding principal, which was valued around 132 billion, plus any accrued interest. If that settlement value on the day of exchange was 100% or 100 cedis, as soon as the exchange happens, per the financial terms of the exchange, this 100% reduces to 50% using the original coupons on the old bonds. Okay, that is, investors would have lost 50% of their settlement value or the face value of the bond if they go ahead with the domestic debt exchange. Now, using the original coupons is a very conservative estimate And as a matter of fact, it is not very realistic. Okay. So we went on further to analyze more realistic cases. Well, if the government was due to default, or if the government was paying you your settlement value for cash, the more realistic question is, what would you have done with your cash? Most people tend to buy T-bills. Okay, so the real opportunity cost of engaging in this domestic bond could be the T-bill rates. We use T-bill rate as the yield to maturity. And then we realized that for 100 cedis settlement value, you would have lost roughly about 77.8% of the value. That is, you would have been left with only 23 cedis the moment the debt exchange happened. Okay. And then finally, we went on to analyze even a more realistic case, which is the purchasing power. All right. When we have money, we don't just keep money in our bank accounts. We keep money so that we can spend. All right. How this debt exchange would affect investments or investors' portfolio using the real purchasing power, which is inflation. Now, when we evaluated the debt exchange program, the domestic debt exchange program, using inflation as the yield to maturity, we realized that investors were losing close to 88.2%, right? So initially, if the settlement value was 100 cedis, investors would have been left with 11.8 cedis. Now, these results were very striking, and then they were extremely damaging. We compared our results to some of the domestic debt exchange programs that has happened elsewhere, not only in Ghana. And we realized that on average, investors lose close to somewhere between 30 to 50%. That is, investors lose roughly about, on average, 30% of their investment. In our case, investors were losing between 50 to 88% of their investment, which was extremely huge, especially on the wealth of investors. What does the government get from the domestic debt exchange program? At the beginning, I told you the overarching goal for this DD is to be part of a full set of measures to reduce the present value of public and publicly guaranteed debt to GDP ratio from over 100% to 55% by 2028. Well, the domestic debt exchange program alone will not help the government achieve that objective. There are other measures like the fiscal adjustments, the external debt, the structural adjustment, which also have to contribute to reduce the debt to GDP ratio to the target of the 55%. So it is very difficult to evaluate this program on that target, especially due to our limited information. On the other programs that are that are supposed to be implemented to help achieve that target. So what we actually did was to investigate the impact of the domestic debt exchange program on the current year, the budget that the government presented. Our findings showed that if this domestic debt exchange program, as proposed in the 24th December memorandum, goes ahead, the government would have roughly about 22.7 billion cedis in fiscal space. That is, the government would have excess of 22 billion from the budget. And how did we arrive at this number? In the budget, the domestic interest payment budgeted was about 34 billion Ghana cedi. The overall deficit was 61 billion Ghana cedis. Using the 67 bonds that were eligible from the domestic debt exchange program, the government would have paid 23 billion cedis to holders of those 67 bonds this year. So meaning that out of the budgeted 34 billion, 23 billion would have been paid to the eligible bond holders. This implies that the interest payment on eligible bondholders was close to about 70% of the budgeted domestic interest payment. According to the Domestic Debt Exchange Program's financial terms, in this year, the government is scheduled to only pay about 600 million Ghana cedi. This 600 million Ghana cedi is from the 2% cash tender fee the government was going to pay on the 2023 bonds. Okay. So instead of the government paying 23 billion this year, they were only going to pay 600 million. By so doing, they would reduce the deficit from 61 billion to 38 billion cedis, and then create for themselves a fiscal space of 22 billion cedis. Okay. What does this mean for the government? I know we are supposed to talk about investors, but I also want to try to balance the scale of the argument. Well, this is extremely good for the government. Okay, if this goes ahead, it would really help the government's finances. The reason is because when the budget was initially read, I, for one, was extremely skeptical about how the government was going to finance this 61 billion Ghana cedis. If you read the budget carefully, you'd realize that the government put an asterisk on the overall deficit and then claimed that the overall deficit will be financed by multilateral agencies and then foreign partners. Well, this is an extremely vague way to describe how you are going to finance your deficit, especially when you are in a fiscal distress. Okay. I initially thought this would be a repetition of what happened in 2022. Okay. For those of you who have been following the budget and then the fiscal activities of the government, it won't surprise you to know that in the year 2022, the Bank of Ghana, who is the central bank of Ghana, and who is the central bank, actually financed a large chunk of the deficits. Close to about 80% of the deficit that was incurred in 2022 was financed by the Bank of Ghana. There are big disadvantages if your central bank has to finance your spending as a government. Well, it is no surprise that we have a 54.1% inflation if this continues. Okay. So I was thinking, is this going to be a repetition of 2022? Is the Bank of Ghana going to step in again? Well, my biggest worry was the Bank of Ghana was in a position to do that in 2022, but they were not in a position to do that in 2023, simply because they have run out of reserves. Okay, the Bank of Ghana does not have the firepower they did last year to finance the budget. So the government needed to find a way to be able to finance this budget deficit. If the if the domestic debt exchange goes ahead, this would prove that the government would have made a significant effort in reducing the deficit from 61 billion to just about 38 billion. With the IMF money coming in, if they get 3 billion, that would be very close to financing the deficit. Okay. I would like to end my presentation by talking about our work as a research committee with the Individual Bondholders Forum. The Individual Bondholders Forum is an advocacy group that represents individuals with investments in the 67 eligible bonds, including those in collective investment schemes like TESA clients or those in mutual funds. When we did our analysis and we saw that investors were losing between 50 to 88%, this was striking to us. And initially what came to our mind was individuals who are not companies or big banks would struggle to be able to survive with this kind of losses. Okay, so the research committee of TESA has been working hand in hand with the technical committee of the Individual Bond Forum to negotiate an exemption for individual bondholders, which would cover everyone in a collective investment scheme. Well, in our negotiation with the government, we have made it clear and we have maintained that all individual bondholders should be exempted from the domestic debt exchange program, purely because they cannot contain this huge amount of losses that the DDE would impose. Instead, we have made several proposals to the government to achieve the debt sustainability. We agree with the government that the country needs to be on a path of debt sustainability. We agree that our current debt to GDP ratio is high. We need to find a way to reduce it from the 100% to the 55% by 2028. We don't disagree with the government on that. What we mainly disagree is the path of achieving that objective. We maintain that the objective can still be achieved if individual bondholders are exempted from the domestic debt exchange program. Instead, we have proposed that the government should consider major fiscal readjustment, which we have proposed a number to them. We have also proposed that they revise the current proposal to the structured groups such as banks and insurance entities, since they have more capacity to absorb the losses than individuals. And we've also made a strong proposal for the government to show strong commitment to fight corruption. From the Auditor General's report, it is no secret that there are huge leakages and inefficiencies in the government. We have proposed measures by which the government can close those leakages and become more efficient with small revenue that they receive from the taxpayer. Thank you. I would like to end my presentation here.